Well, it's been a week, but here I am, and I wanted to tell you after this week I'll be moving on to another book I need to read for my research. It's really interesting. I've already read a little bit of what Standing has to offer. Guy Standing, and if I didn't pronounce that correct because it should be Guy, sorry. He is a professor from the UK, and this book is called The Precariat, The New Dangerous Class. It's published by Bloomsbury, and I understand Standing to be a good source for the concept of the precariat. It was first published in 2011, so I'm going to move on to that because right now I'm writing a chapter that includes, I have to know more about this concept. So today, though, I want to finish up the Outline of Sanity, and I'm going to just draw out a few big ideas that I got from the end of this book. And by the way, Chesterton also writes a conclusion here, or a summary, which is great, and at some point I might just read that as an addition for the channel, because it's really good, but I think I'll wait a while and then go back to it. But it reveals that even though this was written in stages, and I think it was first published in newspaper columns, that it was conceived of as a whole, and it does read that way. So one of the big ideas that I drew out of the last few chapters of this book is Chesterton's critique of capitalist leisure. So, the big dream that he perceives of advocates of automation, and sort of the miracle of capitalism is that, the dream of less work, okay? That, one of the benefits of automation is definitely less work over time. Not at the moment, I take it, but, the vision of the future. And that with enough automation, you'd simply get hardly any work at all. Life would be an awful lot of leisure. But so he zeroes in on leisure and looks at that, and I have to say it's a criticism of mass entertainment, basically, and mass society. So you get some of Chesterton's conservative impulses here. He doesn't like mass entertainment. It's passive. He makes quite a big deal over the fact that it's not so much that it's stupid, although maybe he might think so, but he doesn't emphasize that. Things like going to the movies, reading magazines. He gripes about how you could pick up one magazine, read an article or a story halfway through, pick up another one. You're going to find basically the same story written in the same sort of way. It's almost like a seamless experience. He sounds a little bit of an elitist here, but not in the typical sense, because as we'll see, and you've already seen, he's not arguing that we need to have intellectual elites guide our tastes. Rather, there's elites that are, nefariously kind of feeding pablum to the masses, conditioning them to consume this passively, and it's the passive factor that he doesn't like, right? So he's actually not an elitist, he's an advocate of the common person, and he's arguing that this is among the factors that is sort of dumbing people down and not allowing them to entertain themselves, not allowing them to work creatively and to recreate creatively so that they can understand themselves and experience their lives more fully. He says the man may only work for an hour. That wasn't coming anytime soon and still isn't, but the utopian vision. A man may work for only an hour with his machine-made tools, but he can only run away and play for 23 hours with machine-made toys. Everything he handles has come from a huge machine that he cannot handle. Again, machine in the largest sense of the word. Hollywood, a kind of machine cranking out movies, standards, like today TV programs often do the same thing, mass entertainment. I have a picture of The Bachelor up there because, that formula has been repeated so many times, and I'm sure you've noticed that. You can go to a movie, especially if it's animated, and it's like you've seen that movie literally, in the case of sequels, but even if not a sequel, you've seen that movie before. And, this is impoverishing to the human spirit from Chesterton's perspective. Now, last time I mentioned, maybe the distributist economy would include today, in contemporary case would be to include, 3D printers. And one of the viewers rightly pointed out, well, not really. 3D printer doesn't necessarily allow for that creativity and real craftsmanship, but maybe it does. But more so, it's a matter of ownership. And so the real question is, whether machinery or no, who owns it and who controls it? And the distributivist ideal is, of course, it has to be owned and controlled by the individual, by the family, within the community. And definitely for Chesterton, it comes across here, craftsmanship is the ideal. The ideal person is a craftsman. So whether they're using a 3D printer or, an old-fashioned forge, the matter is, are they using their capabilities of creativity and skill to the utmost? Are they able to develop them? And that reminded me of what Eugene McCarraher wrote about in The Enchantments of Mammon, where he dwelled on the arts and crafts movement. And Chesterton is no doubt picking up on that. He mentions Ruskin and Morris in these chapters, and Ruskin in particular is a favorite romantic thinker of McCarraher's. So anyway, he says, if the small man found his small mechanical plant helpful to the preservation of his small property, its claim would be very considerable. And he says this in the context of he's not bad-mouthing machinery across the board, okay? Yes, machinery is suspect to Chesterton, but small machinery or machinery that is to the scale of the human being is better, and some machinery can be helpful actually to the liberation of people from the larger machinery, okay? But coming back to the point about recreation, he says, but if the holidays provided for the mechanic are provided as mechanically as at present, and with the merely mechanical alternative offered at present, I think that even the slavery of his labor would be light compared to the grinding slavery of his leisure. So there's another slam to mass entertainment. I'm trying to think, at the time, the cinemas would have been a huge deal. People going to movies, it was something very new. There was a real fascination, I think, with the technology itself. Same thing happened when TV came on board later. There wasn't that much on TV as I understand it, but people were just fascinated by the technology and they sort of fell enthralled to it. And I think that Chesterton is pretty deeply offended by people falling in love with or enthralled to this technology. And he envisions the future where people become more and more kind of these slaves to the machinery. The machinery takes precedence over their individual lives and their development. And so that brings me to his point about Ford. Now, if you recall, McCarraher was all over Fordism, Fordism, then Taylorism before it, the theory that, or the practice of training workers to work with minimal skills, minimal need to train, mechanical tasks that were repetitious in a factory setting. The beauty of this, part of it was there was a snobbery on the part of the people who developed these techniques that the working class person was really incapable of creativity and deploying their talents and really didn't want to think and needed to be kind of reined in, because what really ruled them, according to this prejudice, was, they wanted to drink a lot, they wanted to cavort and carouse, they wanted to, sleep around. They had all sorts of vices that only good hard work and regimentation would be able to get a handle on. So it was good for them, and it was good for America, and it produced these standardized cars and other things. And And so everything would be good, and we would always have this class of workers that would be bettered by this kind of regimentation. And if it weren't for the Ford factory, in a way, well, they'd just be completely bums, I guess. They'd be destitute. But Chesterton pleads the workers' case. And he basically says, we all know people who have these kind of jobs, but who are like scholars on the side. I think even more so now, when so many people really are like they're not all in factories now, but we've got a ton of people working in low wage kind of routine jobs, even jobs that required quite a bit of in inventiveness in the past, such as the person who manned the checkout counter at a restaurant or a donut shop or a bookstore or something like that. Now everything is mechanized for them. Those people, if they are going to kind of survive that type of work, they develop interest. And some of them develop very strong interests and become great experts, really scholars, or they become artists, or they become expert mechanics. And they can do many, many useful things that are not at all recognized by the Fords of the world. They don't even know that people have these skills. And I think that Chesterton just sees this as a huge tragedy. On the one hand, it's good that people kind of survive by creating this alternative reality for themselves in which they really can apply their interests and their brains. But why couldn't they use this directly? Wouldn't that be a better world for them? Okay, not just in the name of efficiency, because I don't think that's Chesterton's primary value, but rather for their quality of life. It's one thing to have a hobby and a sort of quirky interest, and it's another thing to actually be a teacher, right? Or a mechanic, somebody who actually fixes things and changes things and creates things, invents things, right, with their hands and their brains, that people can recognize and value. So it seems like a great diminishment of people's capacity and capacity for their enjoyment of their lives. So he points this out. Then there's a chapter on emigration and on the British Empire and what this all means. And I think he sees the British Empire partly as, a place to put all of the sort of surplus Englishmen, that can't make a living or can't find a place of independence in their own country, so they go off and they colonize other countries. Here's a map of the British Empire in the 1920s. It was pretty far flung, but it wouldn't be too far before it would come down. By the mid-1940s, it was pretty much over. And it's from reading this chapter, it sounds like Chesterton is well aware that it's beginning to come down. And one of the reasons for that is because the English settlers, the English who go off to these far-flung places to govern them, are extractive, they are dominating, they are not paying attention, they aren't trying to actually settle at all. And in fact, he complains that often they don't know anything much. They aren't serving as intermediaries between the home country and these colonized countries. They know next to nothing, and they learn next to nothing while they are there. And he insinuates that they could learn something about settling, about living in a place, about taking care of it from the people that they're living among, but they don't do that. Settlers, he said, if they are such, really ought to settle in a place. Now, I guess the question was becoming, were they at all welcome? And the answer was soon to be obvious, no, they weren't. But if they were to go to other countries to settle, then in Chesterton's opinion, they needed to do just that and to see their place as sacred and treat it as such, stay put, develop it, and basically engage in the independent life that he is advocating. But he also says we would need less immigration. That is, the Brits would need less immigration if their own people could settle their own land. If enough people had land and had property that they could actually supply themselves from and live from in independence, then there would be less need for immigration. And he makes the point rather strongly in one of these chapters towards the end that religion is a necessary part of seeing the place as sacred. A lot of people would disagree with that, okay? And I am still trying to decide whether I agree with that one or not for sure. To highly value place, is religion necessary? There's really a striking example that he gives towards the end of the French Canadians and an author that he's read by the name of Mr. Hugh Martin, who wrote something in the Daily News. He said he was writing from Toronto, and this was an author that wasn't inclined to be complimentary to the French race, so to speak, he says, which is not a surprise, I suppose, for the Brits. But this author ends up sort of grudgingly but effusively at the same time praising the French Canadians for their rustic way of life, and he ties it up with their Catholic religion. So here's a quote from the author, not from Chesterton. He says, apart from the fact that their women bear an incredible number of children, you have this other consequence of their submission to the priest, that a social organism is created, which is of incalculable value in the backwoods. The church, the school, the curé or priest hold each little group together as a unit. I merely record the fact that the simplicity of these people is providing their salvation and is one of the most hopeful things in Canada today. And then Chesterton uses that to make a similar point that simplicity is underrated. That, the city dweller will say, well, those people in, I guess, what's been the backwoods of French Canada, people who live like that are rustic. They're practically, uncivilized. Who would want to be like that? And Chesterton, again, makes the point here that, what this guy has described is actually the beginning. It's kind of like the kernel of culture, because culture turns on actual community, which requires stability, living in place so that, practices can take their root and traditions can take root, and you have to have cohesion. And for Chesterton, that's facilitated by the priest and the church and all of that. It could be possibly facilitated by another means, but the most important thing probably of universal significance is staying put, which is not something that's admired or encouraged by the urban sophisticate, you might say, or would-be sophisticate. So anyway, I think it will leave it at that, except to say that, basically, and this is a point that I really liked, he said, we need to have an ideal that a lot of people apparently criticize distributists for romanticizing the peasant or the rustic, the yeoman farmer. And he basically says, yeah, we do. Just like the capitalist, like Ayn Rand, idealizes the strong and rugged businessman who's, doesn't brook any sort of control, is combating the state. Or the Soviets, the socialists with their happy workers, healthy, happy, robust, have plenty of time for leisure. So in order to motivate people, in order to give people something to strive for, yes, you do have to have an ideal. One of the nice things about Chesterton, he's conscious of that, and he basically says it is an ideal, but you have to have ideals to strive for. And the independent person, and particularly this, what he calls peasant, is his ideal, and he's not ashamed of it. He's not ashamed of what he calls romantic picture making. It is a goal, he says. So anyway, that is Chesterton's The Outline of Sanity. If you're interested in distributism, as I've said, you can take a seminar this summer. I'll be offering a seminar on distributism, and you can sign up for more information about that seminar by using the form in the notes below the video here. And next on the channel, I will be dealing with standing the precariat, the new dangerous class.